Wait, slideshow, play from the start. Okay. You all can see this okay? PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So what I wanted to cover is some things about trauma. And so I know you all are going to be using Kemetic yoga as you know, as an instrument or a tool for helping people that's been experienced different types of traumatic events. And so having a good overview of what trauma is and the effects of it on various levels of our existence is very important. Okay. And so my approach to doing social work or social services or therapy is to put it, especially with people in our community, is to put it within the context of our overall historical experience and coming from a legacy of or a history of not really a legacy, but a history of oppression that began with enslavement, capture, transportation across the ocean in the Middle Passage, enslavement in the Western Hemisphere, and then centuries of slavery as well as Jim Crow, as well as all kind of other forms of oppression. We have experienced trauma in so many different ways, yet we've also had a resiliency that other groups of people have not had, that has allowed us to survive and actually to thrive in spite of all of those traumatic, in spite of that traumatic background. So, but many people are the suffering or victimized by this trauma. And so this history of trauma, it affects us not only in terms of social indicators and physical indicators and psychological indicators, um, but it also affects us on a genetic level. And some of that trauma or some of the negative effects of that trauma has been embedded into us on a genetic level where it has even begun to become passed on from one generation to the next generation or from parents, to children, and so we're talking about changes in the DNA, damage to DNA that has increased the they have increased the occurrence of various types of disease patterns in our community that we find to be very higher represented in our communities than in other communities. Okay, and so we just want to understand about trauma. Okay, so trauma, the definition is it literally means a wound, injury, or a shock. A traumatic event is one that a person finds overwhelming. People differ in what they find traumatic. However, some events are so stressful that most people would find them traumatic. Okay. And so as I was saying before, we have different, if we look at the history of our experience of the last, say, 400 to 500 years, we can see that there has been a continuous experience of traumatic events that has not stopped, over time. Okay. So in the past, many people believe that only physical harm or danger caused trauma. We now know that emotionally stressful events can also cause trauma, particularly in the absence of caring supports. So when we look at our community, when we look at people that come from families that have been disrupted because of systematic oppression, systematic marginalization, and so on and so forth, we can see that those caring supports are often not there. One of the reasons why I think that African American communities have done well in spite of the trauma is because we have always been able to create those type of supportive mechanisms, those type of supportive you know systems, whether it was the church, whether it was just the nuclear family, whether it was the extended family that was always around us. We have always had those things. But at the same time, those different institutions that have helped us to develop resiliency have been challenged and have been, affected in negative ways that has allowed trauma to actually infect us. And as I was talking, the movie Sinners, I think you all probably have seen the movie Sinners, and that movie came into my mind as I was thinking about it. And I think there's some examples of trauma, and trauma in relationship to how the institutions that we have and the different cultural um, institutions that we have, like our music and our art, have been challenged and put under stress by the various oppressive systems that we have come in contact with. Okay. So, so what are traumatic events? You have natural disasters such as earthquakes and floods. So think about Katrina, right? The hurricane Katrina that came and destroyed New Orleans and was particularly more damaging and affecting African American communities than any other communities. Whenever there is a natural disaster, um, our communities are more harshly affected. Our communities are more likely to be underserved by emergency responders because of the fact of who we are and because of the fact that we are not valued and those type of things. You have war and conflict. Um, you know, we have being a victim of crime, being raped, assaulted, held up or carjacked. These, whenever crime occurs, it is more likely to be committed by people of the same community, whether you're white or black or Latino, whatever you are. But you know, but we do have higher rates of crime on a per capita basis in our communities because of the differential in economic viability in our communities. Being involved in or witnessing a serious accident. And so, in more economically disadvantaged communities and more marginalized communities, you're going to see a higher incidence of certain types of accidents, such as car accidents, such as other types of incidents where people can become injured, being exposed to death, injury, or violence through work or volunteer roles. Um, so in our work, we do see a higher degree of, violence and injury and so on and so forth. Um, if we're doing work in our communities, we are going to see more of these type of incidents. Being exposed to an unexpected, tragic, or stressful event, unexpected violent death of a loved one, complicated or violent childbirth, enduring painful or degrading medical procedure. Um, we experience these things at a higher level, to a higher degree of to a higher degree than other communities do. Um, I remember driving down the street the a few months ago, and the street was sort of blocked. There was some cars blocking, like this blocking the street. When I got there, I saw a woman jumped out of her car, and she went over to there was like some blood splattered all over the street. And she got out the car and she fell down to her knees and was crying. And then when I saw on the news that her daughter had been killed, so you can just imagine this happening to you and you having to see, the spot where your child had died and where her blood was still just laying out there in the street. I think her body had been moved, but the blood was still there. So it must have been I could just imagine how that woman was feeling. And so, you multiply that experience um, many times, and you see that, there's a lot of this type of trauma that's occurring in our community. I myself, um, I've had four children. Two of my sons passed away in the last maybe 6 years, or 6 or 7 years or so. Um, so you had to find ways to develop resiliency and ability to overcome or to at least cope, with these types of situations. We know that in our community that um, complications from childbirth is at a higher incidence because of the fact that it seems that there's this underlying negative effect of living in a racist white supremacist society that causes a stress that is expressed in the rates of mortality and morbidity related to childbirth. And so we see that in our community that women, regardless of their economic status or their social status, the black skin, the fact of being black, increases the risk of complications and the risk to child and maternal health, during childbirth and so on and so forth. And so there is like a underlying malaise. It's like because of what you call it um these unseen and these just constant experiences of racism or being the feeling that you are being treated or dealt with differently because of your race. The knowledge that that this is going on, seems to be able to create a ongoing sense of stress among people. And this underlying anxiety affects many different things in terms of our health and our ability to just live a normal life. Okay. So you also have interpersonal violence or abuse. And in communities where people are economically disadvantaged, where a let's say a father or a husband, the breadwinner, is placed in a situation where he is not able to win the bread, he is not able to fulfill his perceived role as being the provider for the family, that this causes certain types of stress, which in turn actually causes this breadwinner, of this leader of the family, or person who perceives himself to be the leader of the family, to actually turn against the family, turn against his wife, turn against his children, and actually become more abusive. This is going to correspond also with an increase in substance abuse, alcohol abuse, and other types of maladaptive behaviors, because of a lack of resources to support this person or this family, and also a lack of internal resilience, because of the conditions that we are in are so so under resourced, for in various ways, So we see an increase in child abuse. We see an increase in spouse abuse, domestic violence, and also domestic sexual abuse increases in these situations. Okay. We have serious lack of care, emotional connection, or neglect, particularly when a baby or young child, including prolonged separation from caregivers. And so my background is coming from, among other things, children and family services. And so I worked in the child welfare system for 13 years. And so I know that statistically we have higher rates of children separated from their family. The time that a child is placed in care, in foster care, or other types of separation situations from their families, such as group home, juvenile detention center, you know, prison, and so on and so forth, that these periods of time, or these type of separation, these type of experiences, the time of separation is longer, and the frequency of the number of separations amongst our families is higher. So we have higher rates of foster care, higher rates of children taken into protective custody, and the period of time that they spend in those situations are longer. Okay, so all of these things are affecting our community as a whole, and it is affecting our community on a health level, on a social level, and as people who are working with communities to provide services, to provide care, to provide therapy, and so on and so forth. It is incumbent upon us to have a global understanding of the environment that the people we're working with come from. What often happens from what I can see and from my experience, and also from just studying of the literature and so on and so forth, is that even people who are working in the field have sort of an animosity against the clients because they see the clients as being dysfunctional rather than and sort of almost responsible for their own situation instead of having the ability to see the client in the context of the social and cultural and economic and political systems that are impacting them and causing them to be moved and shaped in the way that they are. The economic displacement, the political neglect, the lack of the intentional lack of resources in terms of education, medical, and so on and so forth. All of these things are affecting communities in a negative way and bringing about the different psychological dysfunction, physical health problems, and social dysfunction that we see in our communities, that we see in our clients. So again, in my experience, I would see foster parents, for example, they would blame the child for the child's dysfunctional behavior rather than understanding that they are a foster parent to a child that's been abused and neglected. And this child who's been abused and neglected is going to have naturally, is going to naturally have behaviors and thinking patterns that are going to be challenging to the caregiver. And so you have to look at it in that context. And so when I would do foster parent training, I would try to get them to understand these things. But even in terms of a lot of the foster parents I worked with, for example, um, they would just feel as if it was a personal insult to them. I'm trying to help this child, but this child is acting out. And they don't understand the various dynamics of why that child is acting out. If you have a child that's being placed, who has a history of being placed many times with many different caregivers. They may have gone from foster care to group home, back to foster care, and so on and so forth. They have an expectation that they're gonna be released back away from this situation, that they're going to be rejected, that they're going to be mistreated because they have experienced mistreatment, either psychological mistreatment and even physical mistreatment in their experience in group homes and their experience in foster homes. And so when they get so when they get to their third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th placement, they have an expectation that this is going to be a situation that's going to go negative. And it's like, why should they invest themselves emotionally into adapting to a situation that they know that they're going to experience rejection? So all of these things affect all of these different traumatic effects, traumatic events affect the functioning and how children are going to respond. And you can just multiply that to children, adults, and so on and so forth. So that's why a higher level of children that's been involved um, with the child welfare system wind up in prison. So if you did a survey and you went to the different young people or different older people even that's locked up in prison, you would find that a high percentage of them come out of the child welfare system. Okay, so so when we look at you know what we call complex trauma, um, we could see like this sort of a pyramid of um of experiences and events and conditions that are affecting what we call trauma. Okay, and so let me see, I'm sort of hiding. I can't see this whole thing. Okay. Okay, so complex trauma describes a particular type of trauma that goes beyond a one-time incident. Okay, it tends to be repeated or ongoing, be difficult or impossible to escape from, occur within a personal relationship, begin in childhood so that it affects a child's development, and be covered up, kept secret, or denied. So when we look at this pyramid, we can start at the bottom, at the base of the pyramid, right? And so we see at the base of the pyramid adverse childhood experiences. Okay. So let's think about a child that's growing up and experiencing different traumatic events during their childhood, right? During their early childhood. And this is where you start to develop a cycle of these various experiences that your child is having, and then the child having to respond or react to these different experiences in a way that might be maladaptive and maybe um, maladaptive and antisocial, so-called antisocial. I don't really like to use that word antisocial because it's like, of course I'm antisocial because it's like, what do you expect me to be? Society has treated me poorly. Why wouldn't I be antisocial? So that's the effect. But what we see in the green spot where it says disrupted neurological or neurodevelopment, so we know that that the brain of the child is very malleable, and so early childhood experiences in the vulnerable brain of the child um, can have long lasting effects. And so this disrupted neurological or neurodevelopment is very key to understanding what happens to people and why do people wind up into prison. Why do people wind up becoming addicted to drugs and alcohol and so on and so forth? Because the effect of these adverse childhood experiences disrupt their ability for their brains to develop properly and for them to develop proper thinking patterns, right? And so, in some of the things we're going to look at a little bit later, you're going to see that there are changes in the actual structure of the brain in people that have experienced a lot of trauma. Okay. And so this disruption in the neurological development of the child leads to social, emotional, and cognitive development. That's the third level up on your pyramid. Um, Social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. So, social impairment is going to be how do they get along with others? Emotional impairment is going to be how do they respond and react to different situations that they find themselves in. Cognitive impairment is how are they going to be able to perform in school? How are they going to be able to perform academically? Their ability to learn. Oftentimes, they may be diagnosed with ADHD, hyperactivity, and so on and so forth, right? Even though sometimes and oftentimes those diagnoses are improper or misdiagnoses, right? Adoption of health and risk behaviors, adoption of health risk behaviors. So that's when they start to self-medicate, they smoke cigarettes, they drink alcohol, they start to take drugs, and so on and so forth. Then you have disease, disability, and social problems. So you see people on the street. You see people, if you probably have seen people in our community who are on the current drug, which is predominantly out here called fentanyl, right? And you could see this really strange and weird um, behavior or effect of the fentanyl where the person gets stuck. And you see, like I've seen people walking down the street and then all of a sudden they just stop and they're stuck in that one spot in a sort of bent over condition, and I might walk away and come back an hour later, and the person is still there, or I may walk away and come back, and then I see the person all of a sudden pop out of that stuck condition and start walking again. These are weird things. You see in our community, we see people like in Chicago, around where I live. I live on 45th Street in Chicago, on 47th Street in Chicago. Um, if you drive down the street, you just see everybody. You see a large percentage of people. You can look at them and you can tell that they are drug addict, that they are alcoholic, that they have various types of disabilities. Most of the people are getting disability checks because they have been diagnosed as being or determined to be disabled because of their drug and substance abuse, disabled because of the various diseases and disabilities that come along with that, with that use of drugs and alcohol and cigarettes and all the other things that they're doing. We see that there's a higher preponderance of dialysis um, um, companies and centers in our community because they're making money by servicing this higher level of people who have damaged their kidneys because of the alcohol and drug and substance abuse and so on and so forth. Okay. So you have disease, disability, and social problems. And then that leads to early death. We know that in our communities, that people, that men especially have much, they die at a much earlier age than people in other communities. Men die at an earlier age than women in general, and black men die at an earlier age than anybody else in American society. Women die at an earlier age than white women, and so on and so forth. When you look at a city like Chicago, Chicago is the third largest city in the United States. But in Chicago, you have such an extreme variance in death and mortality rates. So, for example, in Chicago, we have communities like where I live. I live in the hood. I live in Bronzeville. So, I don't know the exact number, but we have in this community, which is varied. We have people who are wealthy in our community, and we have people who are very poor and and have many different social problems and disabilities in the Bronzeville community. But then so we have a death rate, which means that people die quicker and sooner in the Bronzeville community. But you have other communities of white people in Chicago, and these people they have a that there is one community where the white folks live in that community up to being, up to 100 years old, you know, and there's a much higher number of these people that reach the age of 100. Now you can find black folks that reach 100 years old, but you're gonna find very few of them. So the percentage of people who actually can reach that higher extended age, go past their 70s, go past their 80s, go past their 90s. You're gonna find people in those demographics, but you're not gonna find a high percentage of them. Whereas you have other communities in Chicago who have high percentage of people who reach up to be into the 80s, 90s, and hundreds, you know. And so that's because when you look at the conditions, when you look at the social, political, economic conditions and the forces that are creating negative conditions that impact their lives, we see that there's a higher preponderance of those things in these Black communities than there are in the white communities, right? And so, again, we have to put all of this information into the context, and we can see that that there is not that there is not a problem with personal responsibility, which is the way that the culture is trying, or that the mainstream culture or the mainstream society is trying to portray, but it is a problem of economic, social, political displacement and marginalization, which is intentionally built into the system, which is causing these disparities, which is causing this increase in trauma and so on and so forth, and even making people more vulnerable by taking away any types of structures that can help to produce resiliency to mitigate the negative effect of these things. So things that create resiliency is like early childhood care, you know, where a child and a mother can get support and at an early stage, these programs where um, even things like WIC means women, infants, and children, or something like that. But the original intention of WIC was to teach women to breastfeed. That was one of the first intentions of the WIC program, was to teach women and encourage women to breastfeed. What we have found is that number one, when women breastfeed to children, a breastfed child has a better cognitive and emotional outcome than children who are bottle fed. Okay. And so in the Latino community, um, the incidence of breastfeeding is higher because mothers or grandmothers pass on the knowledge and the encouragement to breastfeed to the birth mother. So the grandmother is giving its information, giving its encouragement, giving its knowledge to her daughter, who is giving birth. And so that child gets the benefit of that. So just the idea of getting the attachment, getting the touch, getting the increased nutrient from breastfeeding that cannot be duplicated by any type of bottle feeding. Okay. And so hearing the heartbeat of the mother, feeling the touch of the mother, um, being, so you look at African culture, you see how people attach the baby to their back or to their front, and the baby is just there all the time, and this baby is being supported. And in my travels to Africa, just dealing with African people, dealing with African children, you could see that there is a difference in their emotional behavior, in their cognitive behavior, in the level of maturity that your children have, who have experienced this type of nurturance, coming up as children. You could see a profound difference in how these children are behaving, how these children are interacting, the way that they're operating, you know. And so that just the simple fact of breastfeeding has a profound effect upon the psychological and physiological development of the child, and also the cognitive development of the child. Okay. So these are just examples. But WIC has changed, but politically, WIC was changed from a program that encouraged women to breastfeed to a program that was giving out Infamil and this artificial crap garbage that they call milk, you know, from a cow, you know. So it went from encouraging women to, be mothers and naturally take care of their children to being something that was designed to give supports to the dairy industry. Okay. So think about that. It was designed to give support to the dairy industry by having the government buy up surplus cheese and other types of milk products and then give this to poor people, you know. And that's where you get this whole stereotype of the government cheese and all this kind of stuff, right? Because all of these things were created not to serve the community, but to serve the wants, not the needs, but the wants of corporate entities like the dairy industry. And so even if you operate in let's say you operate a preschool or early childhood development center, and they have certain rules in place. Well, these children can only receive dairy milk from a cow, or dairy products. So if you try to give them almond milk or oat milk or soy milk or something like that, you have to have the express um, written consent of the parent to give them these alternative to dairy and more and essentially more healthier types of milk, to them. So that's and so I'm spending a little bit of time on this because it's always a large component of what we're seeing is related to nutrition. So for example, a cow's milk has 10 times the amount of sodium in it than a mother's breast milk. The cow's milk has and I can't think about it all of the numbers that I used to know, but the cow milk has a much higher level of the bad cholesterol, what you would call LDL. LDL cholesterol is low density lipoprotein. And so that is the type of animal fat that your body has a hard time processing and that causes the congestion, causes and leads to things like asthma. The higher rates of asthma that exist in our community is because of the consumption of cow's milk and other types of animal products, but especially the cow's milk. Cow's milk is most people, most black people, most people who are not even white people, the main people on the planet Earth who actually have the enzyme in their body that can digest cow's milk are Northern European people because they over time because of their climatic and environmental conditions that move them to have the ability to drink and consume and digest um, cow's milk, they developed that enzyme. But Mediterranean white people, Africans, so on and so forth, do not have that enzyme that allows them to be able to drink or to process cow's milk. So that's what you call lactose intolerance. So our communities are lactose intolerant, but we are forced in various manners to consume cow's milk. Whenever somebody wants to have a party for children, they take them to Chuck E. Cheese, right? They order pizza, so on and so forth. All of these things, all of these behaviors are leading to unhealthy conditions, okay? And so those things needed to be said in the context of these things, right? Um, and so let's look at this other part over here to did I go through this? Complex trauma describes a particular type of trauma that goes beyond a one-time incident. It tends to be repeated or ongoing, okay? Be difficult or impossible to escape from. So think about all of this Epstein stuff, right? We look at, the way the media portrays like the Epstein situation is something that was occurring. And it's like, oh, this was a big thing. The Epstein files and the things that Epstein was doing is a tiny, tiny portion of the true impact or the true incidence of human trafficking and sex slavery that exists on this planet. Okay. And so you think about situation where it's impossible for you to escape from. So this type of human trafficking, this type of sex trafficking is basically situation that people cannot escape from. But we do see people that have gone through these experiences in our work. And we have to work with these people. We have to deal with these people. And we can see the psychological and psycho-emotional and cognitive damage that has occurred in these people. And they have a higher rate of suicide. They have higher rates of substance abuse and all types of other behaviors that need to be dealt with in a healing environment. Okay. Um, these traumatic, complex um, situations, they occur within a personal relationship. So we see many situations where a spouse is being exploited. Well, and sometimes it could be most of the time, of course, it's going to be the female spouse, but oftentimes but sometimes it could be the male spouse also in the relationship, whether they're the spouse or just a significant other, whatever. Um, and then we see that things begin in childhood so that it affects the child's development and be covered up, kept secret, or denied. So oftentimes, people who abuse children sexually, who do sexual exploitation to children, sexual abuse to children, they get away with it because the child feels ashamed. The child often feels as if the abuse that they experienced was their fault, and they feel ashamed and they feel unable to talk about it. So that's why people who work in this field need to understand the psychology of the abused child and understand that this child has a problem with expression, that this child has a problem with guilt, that this child has a problem with shame, because the abuser has psychologically manipulated that child to feel in these ways, right? So this is part of the abuser's plan. This is part of their strategy to be able to take advantage of this individual person by making them feel as if the problem is their fault and or the abuse is their fault, and also even threatening them using threats of violence against them or against their parents or their caretakers or their loved ones and so on and so forth, right? And unfortunately, we have many incidents where parents are actually selling their children or making their children available for sexual exploitation. Okay. And so, again, these are things that are covered up in Black communities, unfortunately, because of the legacy of slavery and many other factors. There is a dark secret in many Black families that is sort of pervasive of this cover up of sexual abuse, this cover up of sexual exploitation on the part of an adult against a child. It could be a mother, it could be a father, it could be an uncle, a brother, a sister, it could be all these different a grandparent, a godfather, a godmother, all those type of things, family friends, and so on and so forth, which are committing these abuses. You know, when you get into people that live in the Caribbean, you get into people that live in Africa, and we see what you call it, sex tourism or whatever, where people from other countries come and they paying people who are poor. They're paying people who live in certain types of situations to or it may not be where they just like, here, I'm going to give you $5 and I let me have your child or whatever. It may just be they develop a relationship where and I've seen, everything I'm talking about are things that I have seen myself. I have seen it either in my own personal life, or I have seen it in as I've been traveling and observing and watching, and also in my professional life, working with families and individuals that have been through these different situations, and also from what I can see from the literature, right? What's in the literature. And so, what I have seen is that you see people create relationships with families and where they are giving money. I've seen white folks come down to Jamaica, make friends with a parent or a grandparent, and then has access to the children. And then this family is poor, underfinanced, and so on and so forth. And so you got this white person with the ability to give them $500 a month, and then this white person is making so-called making friends with the children, and then actually exploiting the children. But then the caretaker of the children has an economic incentive to turn their head, to not pay attention, to deny what's actually going on, even when and then even to the point that when they're being confronted with the facts of the situation, that they continue to deny it. And this happens in many families. It happens in American in America, and it happens in Africa and the Caribbean and other places where all of this type of situations occur. Okay. And so these things are kept covered up, they're kept secret or denied. And so therefore, people never have a chance to recover from these things, you know. And so when by the time they come to somebody like us who are trying to be a healer, who is trying to create a therapeutic relationship, you have to work through a whole bunch of different issues in order to get to the problem, and so it's a complex web and web of layered obstacles that you have to work through. Uh, okay, what's wrong with my thing? Okay. Okay, so common causes of complex trauma. I'm sort of going through those things already because so we got common causes of complex trauma such as child abuse, domestic violence, However, complex trauma is also seen among people who have survived imprisonment, torture, or sex trafficking. Being a refugee or being exposed to long-term conflict can also cause complex trauma. And another thing that causes trauma is simply having a man like Donald Trump as the president of the United States and recognized as the most powerful man in the world. And when children, this is what I know for a fact, when children see his face, when children hear his voice on TV, and they know that this man is the president, they know that this man is in charge, and they can see his maliciousness, they can see that he is malevolent, and they feel threatened, they feel uncomfortable, they feel traumatized by this stuff, you know. And the difference, think about the difference between when Obama was the president and the difference with Trump being the president. And when you see Trump, when you see Obama, you see somebody that looks like you. You see somebody who talks in a gentle, kind way, in a rational way. You see somebody when they interact with children, you see how the little boy you wanted to touch Obama's hair. Oh, your hair is like mine. See, this has a strong psychological effect that people don't understand. People want to talk about policies and stuff like that, which are legitimate topics. But the fact that this black man or a potential black woman who was denied the presidency because of the fact that she was a black woman, the profound effect that these images have upon the subconsciousness and the consciousness of young people cannot be underestimated. Okay. And that's why it's important that we do things like, in my opinion, it's important that we do things like vote and we vote properly and we vote for our self-interest. And even the fact of just simply having somebody who's not a malevolent, malicious, um, uh, narcissist, in that position of power is very important. Okay. And so these things should be, pretty pretty obvious. Okay. So single incident trauma versus complex trauma. So single incident and complex trauma may be similar in many ways, but there are some important differences. Complex trauma has a more wide-reaching effect. This is not just because people with complex trauma have had more episodes of trauma. There are a number of additional reasons why complex trauma results in more significant problems. Okay. And so those things should be pretty obvious that if somebody experiences something one time, that's one thing. But if you experiencing this ongoing threat to you. Your brain is being affected. Your hormones, we talked about the physiology of stress before. So think about this trauma is eliciting this stress response, this activation of the sympathetic part of your autonomic nervous system, this increase in adrenaline, which is going on a ongoing basis all the time, every day. Your system is being shocked. Your system is being flooded with adrenaline and epinephrine and norepinephrine and so on and so forth. All the things that we talked about, all of these different stress chemicals. Okay. Private versus public events. Firstly, single incident trauma such as accidents or natural disasters are more likely to be public events. Other people know about or share the trauma, so there is more community acceptance. This can provide validation and reduce secrecy and shame. So this is important because really when you bring things into the light it has an antiseptic effect, right? So you're sharing, you're sharing your trauma. People know that this thing has occurred. And so it's not a secret, it's not something that you're holding inside of you, which is causing you to have stress and causing you to have an inner toxicity. Okay. Temporal issues. Single incident events usually have a clear beginning and end. Once the event is over, survivors can reach a place of safety and may be able to seek help and recover. However, complex trauma is ongoing or repeated frequently, so there is little time to recover. Complex trauma often occurs in secrecy, so the person is unable or afraid to talk about it and get help. That's why we do something that we call talk therapy, right? Because when people are able to talk things out, when people are able to reason, when people are able to use rationality, they are able to get better. They're able to get help. Okay? They're not in denial anymore. And so these things are very important. Okay? So that should be pretty much understood. Okay, brain development. Also, in most cases, complex trauma begins in childhood or adolescence because the brain is still growing. Ongoing trauma can cause changes in brain structure and functioning that can affect future development. Because survivors have had their development affected, they find it more challenging to cope with everyday life and relationship. Problems with healthy development leads to chronic difficulties with emotions, concentration, and memory, and challenges in having stable and safe relationships. Okay? And so um, the brain is malleable. There's something called what's the term for um the we used to think that the brain was just I can't think of the term right now. If one of y'all know what I'm trying to get to, let me know. Um, but the brain used to be thought of as being set. The brain development used to be thought of being set, but the brain can actually change. It can actually um, change with environmental um, experiences that people are experiencing, and the brain and also the DNA. But I'll remember what I'm trying to say shortly, because my brain is does that sometimes too. Okay, so so brain development can change. So we know that in a child's brain, the early childhood experiences affects the development of the child's brain because the child's brain is just forming, right? So even incidents of illness in early childhood can stunt the child's development and growth. Okay, growth overall, not just in the brain, but in the entire body. So that person, I've seen a situation in twins where one twin got sick, very ill, and then that twin did not develop identical twins, but one twin was sick, and that particular twin that was sick did not develop to the same height and the same stature as their as their as their twin. Okay. Power and vulnerability. In case of the complex trauma, people are often harmed by someone in a position of power over them. Survivors usually feel that they have been unable to escape. This leads to chronic feelings of helplessness. So think about the people that's been sexually exploited by the Catholic priest or by priests or anybody in authority, whether they Catholic priests or preachers or in any type of church situation, any type of clergy, any type of teacher, professor, whatever it is, that people who are being exploited by employers, or whoever it is, a rich person, so on and so forth. They feel they feel helpless because they feel like they don't have the ability to even to escape or to even report what the situation is. So when you look at the testimony and you look at the writings and the testimony of people of the women who have been exploited by in the Epstein files, right? And you find out that many of these women have committed suicide. Many of them have felt unable to go to authorities to report the abuse that they had, the trafficking that they have undergone, and they simply because of the power dynamics. So we underestimate these power dynamics. We underestimate the vulnerability that people feel because of the fact that they are in a situation against a person. You're against a person who's a billionaire or a millionaire, whatever. They much more wealthy, much more powerful than you. People know who they are. If you come out and you say, "Oh, this person did this to me and did that to me," number one, that person has the economic ability to just crush you, and number two, they have the ability to ruin you as an individual because who's gonna believe you? You're just a gold digger. You're just somebody who's trying to exploit money out of this rich person. That's the way that they're able to paint you to be. Okay. So therefore, they leads to chronic feelings of helplessness. Okay. Violation of trust. Complex trauma often occurs within a relationship that is meant to be safe. This leaves the survivor feeling very confused. All humans have an innate need to attach to their caregivers and loved ones. When a caregiver is not safe, this causes a big conflict between needing to connect and needing to be safe. This conflict is not something that people, particularly children, can solve by themselves. It can result in survivors doubting themselves and feeling unsafe when they grow close to people. Okay? So again, you're supposed to feel safe with adults who are older, adults who are in positions of authority, adults who are supposed to be spiritual. So so people are putting a aura of some type of spirituality over this person, some kind of connection with the divine, and so on and so forth. And then this person is abusing you sexually. And this could be going on in a child. It could be going on in a even in adults, you know. And so we could see examples of all of these things, just looking at the current Epstein situation, looking at some of these other situations that have happened in the black church with like say TD Jakes and people like that. And there's a lot of things like that we can find in the media. Okay, shame and self-esteem, secrecy and shame are common in child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence. Survivors often blame themselves. They may doubt their reality and feel alone as if they are the only person this has happened to. They may feel they may feel others can never understand them. And sometimes they feel like others can never understand them with good reason because others often blame them for allowing themselves, so to speak, for being placed in these situations and so on and so forth, right? Self-image. When abuse is long-term, it can affect the survival's sense of self and identity. This means that complex trauma changes the way people think, feel, and behave towards themselves. So they have a problem and an inability to even relate to the self. And that's really deep. They sometimes believe that they are bad, worthless, or broken. These beliefs interfere with self confidence and with relationships. Okay, this cannot be understated. Okay, self image, feeling bad about yourself, feeling as if you are worthless, feeling as if you are broken. Okay, these internal beliefs are very powerful, and these things and these issues are fueling why people have, so many different issues that confront us when we, as helpers and therapists and so on and so forth, are trying to work with them. Okay, so now we get to cognition. People who have had prolonged trauma and could not escape physically learn to use mental strategies to escape. As a result, people with complex trauma may experience problems with thinking and concentration, difficulties feeling present as they go about life, lack of attention, dissociation, and problems with memory. Okay. So cognition, the functioning of the brain's ability to reason, the brain ability to carry out problem solving, the brain's ability to carry out mathematical and logical, rational calculations becomes damaged, and then we have we wonder, well, why did this person make such odd and inappropriate decisions? Why can't they figure out certain things? Because their brain, their cognition, their cognitive mechanisms have been damaged because of the experience that they have had. Okay. And so we can see examples in the brain itself when people's brains are scanned, like through a PET scan, positron emission tomography, PET scans, um, graphics of the temporal lobes in a healthy and abused brain, right? Children with damage to this part of the brain suffer severe emotional and cognitive problems, as well as have difficulty in making and or sustaining positive relationships. So you can see that the brain on the left is healthy. The brain on the right, you can see the underdevelopment of this brain. You can see that there are certain areas of that brain where the synapses and the nerve connections are not making are not working, and so you see a darkness. That's why you see those large dark patches there, because the activity that needs to be taking place in those areas that are indicative of learning, the indicative of different types of cognitive faculties that we are supposed to have, that activity is not taking place there. Okay. So health side effects. So we have depression and anxiety, we have sleep problems, we are feeling suicidal and or using self-harm to cope, unexplained body aches and pains, including migraines, stomach and digestion troubles, and arthritis, type 2 diabetes, sexual difficulties, low energy and fatigue, problems with relationships such as not wanting to be around others, difficulty trusting others, problems protecting oneself in an unhealthy or abusive relationship, and using drugs, alcohol, tobacco, or cover or over and under eating to cope with feelings. This also causes additional health problems. Okay. So all of these different things, these indicators of um, unhealthy things that we go through, that people go through, should be pretty much self-evident that trauma, stress, the things that we talked about before are going to impact these other areas of your life. Okay, social displacement. In addition, because people with complex trauma have often had their development interrupted, they may have lost opportunities. They tend to have lower incomes, less education, and more housing problems. This in turn negatively affects their health. So you can see that this is a cycle. This is a non-ending cycle of pathology, that's originating in marginalization and isolation, on various levels, that is impacting the self-image, the brain development of the self, and so on and so forth, which is in turn having a continuing impact upon a person's ability to even seek out opportunities. When a person gets down so much, they say that I have an intrinsic problem. I have an intrinsic inability. There's something about me as an individual that is preventing me from being able to gain proper employment or to go to school, to learn, to get my education, and so on and so forth. And along with that, they also say that this system is against me. It's impossible for me to go against the system and to get a job. It's impossible for me to go against or get a viable job. It's impossible for me to go against the system and get my education. So therefore, I'm going to engage in um, alternative economics, and I might steal, I might sell drugs. I might do other things, hustle in various other types of ways, go into street level economy in order for me to make money and so on and so forth. But along with that is going to be so much uncertainty that stress is going to be a ongoing accompaniment to this person, which is producing higher rates of hypertension, high blood pressure, which is all leading to higher rates of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and all the other comorbidities that go along with that. Okay. So, um, let me stop this.